Thanks, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for spending, hopefully you're able to join us for an hour and a half today on this topic. We're thrilled to have you here. We're here to talk about our AI and Global Development Playbook. Thanks also to the ITU for not only hosting the summit, but for really giving us a platform to engage and hear you all today. And now, if I reflect even 10 years ago, I think that it would actually be quite remarkable if we were to have anticipated this moment in time where we were all coming together and talking about all things AI. Even a handful of years ago, one might argue that this topic was really just relegated to academia and maybe to the biggest tech players around the world. But we've now seen that this has really captured the interest of everyone, certainly multilateral for civil society, the donor community in international development, even heads of state. In fact, as we track the things coming through our inboxes every day, I would posit that not a week goes by that we don't see some sort of conference or gathering on AI and some sort of sectoral slice of development. So certainly we've arrived at this moment where AI is almost ubiquitous in how we do our development. That is not to say, though, that all things AI are for good or are done in a responsible and ethical way. And that's really where USAID has been focused going back to 2017, when we first started doing our research on the intersection of AI and development. And it really extends to the broader swath of our digital development work at the agency. And it's wonderful to see so many partners in this room that we've been working with over the years, where as we look across all things digital development, as we think about what it takes to foster an open, inclusive, secure, and rights-respecting digital ecosystem in partner countries around the world, this idea of being responsible and ethical and making sure that we're leaning into the full suite of opportunities with respect to AI, while also actively understanding and mitigating the risks, is a tenet that we've taken throughout our work. And so it's something that we fervently believe in. And the effort here among us today is really born out of, in part, the work that USAID did, but also with other parts of the US government under the executive order for safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI that President Biden signed in late October. Under that executive order, USAID, the US Department of State, alongside the National Institute for Standards and Technology, were directed to put together a playbook that is really reflective of the global development community, that really speaks to what we're seeing with respect to risk management best practices as it relates to security, including national security, the health of communities around the world, democratic strengthening, fostering human rights, more expedient and efficient delivery of humanitarian assistance. All of that we've been asked to bring to the fold so that we look at how AI is going to be mitigated and propagated around the world to really have those perspectives in mind. And that's really something that is important to us as an agency as well, that as we shape this playbook, it is reflective of the global development community, that it brings in voices and equities from the global majority, that it looks at what you all are actively exploring in your own programs and areas of focus, and that really truly speaks to how collectively we rally around this topic as a global development community to ensure that it pays dividends for everyone, including the most marginalized around the world. This is an effort that has been several months in the making. The team has already collected a lot of insight and thought from a number of organizations. What they intend to do today is put some of those insights in front of you all and really ask for you to interrogate them, to ask for you to think about what resonates, what really works within your context, your geographies, your sectoral focus, and help us understand where we've gotten it right and where we still need to do more. So that's really why we brought you here. As Stephanie noted, this will be an interactive workshop. It's probably much better than you just looking at us for an hour and a half. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our facilitators. And once again, truly appreciate you choosing this topic choosing this session and joining us here this afternoon.
So hi, everybody. It's amazing to see so many people here, and I'm really excited to get to work with y'all. As Chris mentioned, we're the Emerging Technologies team, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what we're hoping to do together today in this workshop. So I'm going to chat a little bit about what this AI and Global Development Playbook is, why we're doing this, what this thing is that we're hoping to feed into here. I'll talk a bit. We did a request for information a while ago, which if you don't live in government world is basically a formal way that the US government has of asking the public for input. And we got quite a bit of input, and I'll let you know what some of that looked like. We're going to do the workshop thing. So it'll be a deep dive into 3 particular themes. We're going to split everybody up into 3 groups. We're in a room with 4 corners, so that's manageable. And we've got our 3 facilitators here. And then at the end, we'll have each group read out and wrap up. Here we go. Because this is an event hosted by a UN agency, I wanted to give a shout out to the UN resolution that recently passed on the seizing the opportunities of safe, secure, and trustworthy AI for sustainable development. And so this is a part of the context of what we're doing today of trying to operationalize some of the ideas and the principles in the UNGA resolution by really coming up with a playbook that gives tangible ideas for how we can move forward with AI. This other long title here, Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Development and Use of AI that Chris mentioned earlier, this was the executive order that the US government put out at the end of October. And this directs the USAID along with the US Department of State and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST for short, to come up with this guidebook for social, technical, economic, governance, human rights, and security conditions and best practices for programmatic uses of AI in global development. So that's a lot of ground to cover. We're probably not going to end up fully doing justice to all of those topics, but we want to sketch out at a high level what the community is thinking about, what the consensus view is on the way to move forward on this. This is connecting up with the NIST AI risk management framework that you might be familiar with. It has these 4 categories of map, measure, manage, and govern that are really charting a path for thinking about risk in artificial intelligence. So now comes the interesting part. This is what we heard back when we asked the world for input and got 60 or 70 responses back. We were able to kind of aggregate them into these themes. And these were things that people felt were important and really wanted to make sure were reflected and included in the playbook. And today we want to deep dive on 3 of these in particular. We picked these 3 themes because we didn't really have enough information on. So we're hoping to use this exercise as a way to fill in some gaps and get some ideas in places where where the RFI responses indicated that there was something important to be said, but left us wanting a little bit in terms of what to say. One of these is on public participation in AI policymaking. One is on access, or more specifically on broadening access to compute and thinking about the energy consumption of compute. And then the third one is on striking this balance between open source and proprietary models. So again, the goal is to get your input. I will be taking the open source versus proprietary. Help me out here. Which one are you doing, Stephanie?
I'm doing public participation and AI.
Okay, so we've got stacks of Post-it notes and pens. Each of the 3 of us can take a corner. If you feel really drawn to one of those topics, feel free to go join the group. If you are drawn to all of them or to none of them, just join a group that seems like it doesn't have enough people. And we'll take things from there.
Greg, is it fair to say, as folks are reflecting on which group to be in, that the intent here is to pull in not just their own personal and individual perspectives, but representing the organizations for whom they work and what they're seeing on the ground.
Absolutely. Like, we don't want to put anybody on the hook to be an official representative of your organization, but if there are things that you've heard about, if there are things that you know your colleagues care about and you've heard them talk about a lot, feel free to bring those to the table.
And I think we should state, like, everything is non-attributional.
Yeah.
So please, everything will be collected anonymously. We're not gonna ascribe names or anything to anybody. So we want this to be a collegial but like robust discussion.
Yeah.
So welcome your individual points of view, your organizational points of view, anything that can help make this a richer document.
Any questions before we get started?
Actually, I think we have a few
Oh,
prompting.
we have
slides.
more?
Yeah.
Okay. This is basically what I said. We're gonna pick a topic, break it into 3 groups. We'll have facilitated conversations. We'll need 1 volunteer to provide readout. And then, so group 1, is going to chat about this question of what aspects of AI or what types of AI models should remain open source, or which it would be safer to have be proprietary, or if safety is even the right way to frame that at all. Talking about standards for public transparency if companies are developing proprietary models, or even if they're developing open source models, how much do they have a responsibility to share with the public? And then there's been a lot said about the risks of people using open source models to do bad things. And so how worried should we be about that? How do we place guardrails around the use of open source models when open source is inherently difficult to govern? Second group is going to be focusing on public participation in AI policymaking. This is something that's happened at really this kind of rarefied elite level in a lot of cases, but everybody recognizes that it would be nice to have a process that's more democratic and that's involving a broader swath of people. So how could that be changed? What can we do about that? And where have you seen efforts going on around the world to make the formation of national policies more inclusive, and what has worked in that vein? And then the third one is around access to compute and energy consumption. Where do you see opportunities in national or regional computing hubs to help broaden the access to compute and to make compute more energy efficient? How do we operationalize that? How do we make it more sustainable over the long term? Okay, so that is where we're at. We can go through these again if people want to see the questions, but I can take, which room? Sorry.
I was saying, which corner?
Yeah, I was just getting there. Let's take group 1, the open source group in that corner. Group 2, the public participation group back there. And then group 3 on compute and energy in the back, my right, your left corner.
Feel free to bring your chair.
Yeah,
move chairs around.
Rearrange the chairs. They're not bold.
There's some, plush chairs up here.
Not
if
just
you're
you on
looking
one.
for something more comfortable. But it looks like there's some folks that weren't break out.
Open source one.
Now we're moving. You gonna see?
One's going there.
The back panels.
That's the.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Flo and I are.
I don't know.
Feel free to grab a chair. Yeah. Yeah. This is the open source versus proprietary.
They're not wherever.
You see somebody out in context.
I took our slides. Yeah. Grab a stack of post-it notes or a stack to share with your neighbor, and grab a pen if you don't know.
Which one is which? Stephanie, you're over there? Yeah. Okay, this is compute. This is compute. Sorry. I know. Okay, hold on. Okay, this is policy. I'm going.
Okay.
Sachi, which one are you?
So. So, let's start off with just fastest introductions we can manage. You can say your name, where you're visiting from. So I'm Craig Jolly, coming from USAID. This is a room with a lot of people in it, so.
That's University of Oxford.
Looking to see where to go. Okay.
Open source. Love it.
Vipin from Frankfurt.
Nutrition initiative.
We have a few kinds, but not a lot. So you kind of know.
The United Nations Office on Contact.
There's, I think everyone has one.
One in your pocket.
It's gonna be our amazing newspaper.
You're here anyway.
Here's a bit.
So, I think if you want to, if you have ideas, feel free to start jotting those down on post-it notes. Don't feel like you're going to your chair. If you want to come up and slap something up here, you can, or if you are more of a verbal person and you just want to shout out what you're thinking, we can do things that way as well.
I also.
Can we?
Yes.
You know, I like to.
Yeah, okay, so open source is, can be a somewhat complicated term in the AI space. There's a few different levels of open source, right? Traditionally, when people talk about open source software,
For making the
they're referring to software where the source code has been published and is freely available. And where people, and it's licensed in such a way that you can repurchase that. That sometimes there's restrictions on commercial versus non-commercial usage, but the source code is there for people to use, to adapt, to modify, to do what they would like with. The reason I say that gets slightly more complicated with AI is that the source code isn't really stored. That often the source code behind the AI model is generic actually, and what is really determining what happens is all the weights that you've got. If you're training a deep neural network model, you've got this connection of hundreds to billions to more of model weights that are determining the actual behavior of the model. The training data that went in that combined with the model topology and the
Anyway, I like to.
so if people are opening one or two of those three things without opening all of those three things or being concerned about what those three things are, it's a model that is less than completely open, which isn't the end of the world necessarily. But there's a spectrum ranging from cases where all three of those things have been locked down.
I wrote that. You need a better story. It's like with this or
I know,
AI
it's
for
like,
goodness
it's
is
so good.
brutal.
Yeah. Okay, so, what are you thinking about in terms of the difference between something being explained?
So, there are many ways to look at it. If you wanted to,
Yeah.
I feel like it's going to capture the ability of one to understand the model, whatever way of thinking and processing.
Yeah. Well, and so by
Talk out
explaining,
loud.
do you
please
mean
feel free
that
to capture it.
the ability
write
to
down.
interrogate a model and find out why it made a particular inference?
Sure, and then to understand and be able to replicate that.
Yeah.
reliably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a sense in which
Action or add
explanations are going to be
something
more
that first.
trustworthy? Like, I can ask ChatGPT, what were you thinking? Why did you give me that answer? And I don't know that I should believe the answer to that question any more than I should believe the answer to the first question.
Access to
I think that could be a
developing
conversation.
on their own, or are we talking about access to being used to understand the requirements of international text?
Right. So I think if you're, whether you are developing run with your data set. You still need
Yeah, so are you talking about use cases by academic
Where-
researchers or what? Yeah. So one thing I've heard a lot from academic researchers is that they are frustrated with, the model of, I keep picking on OpenAI, but ChatGPT, for example, where, if you're doing a research study, what you can say is, this input got me this output on this day, a future update to the model, and they don't announce when the updates are happening, and you don't know how things might be changed behind the scenes. So they tend to love open source because of the stability. You can run it offline and you have that predictability of knowing that the model weights aren't changing on you.
If that model has to run.
I think the level of base
and you don't have the computing power to run it, then that particular technology or that particular service is. Whether they're developing themselves or something.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, you're approaching this from
We
the
just don't
point of
want this to
view
be
of
fair.
the riskiness of an application, saying, low risk would be, I want it to write dog food jingles for me. High risk would be, I want it to evaluate someone's writing for university.
Is that an AI system for the education?
Right.
Use AI for example.
And so would you be like, how would you picture that risk spectrum aligning with the different flows?
Outside thinking. It's a complicated.
Yeah.
But the same way for. Out of that is born the open AI teams.
to the journey of
Digital
trust.
strategy.
Higher risk, higher openness for higher risk.
They should charge.
Right.
Yeah.
So my former boss.
Right. Well, and where the AI Act gets complicated too is they have this carve out for foundation models, right? So they have this risk tiering by application, but then they say, well, a foundation model like a large language model can be applied to anything. And so that they don't call it high risk, but they treat it as high risk by default because it could be used for any number of things.
Step back.
Yeah.
So I worked in international development and I worked in public and private sector partnerships. I'd be focused on the data that informs open source, whatever source it is, because often it's towards Western data because they have the most infrastructure.
Or at least that's what we assume,
Yes, that's
in
what.
the absence of transparency.
So how can we be more diverse in accumulating data? Various, because if it's open, if it's closed, it doesn't matter. You're just getting it from a specific demographic, just the same.
Well, and if I can push you towards saying something that you actually did, do you feel like transparency around data is actually more important than transparency around model weights or source code?
I think so. Transparency to the extent of anonymized sensitive data. So we don't know who exactly is a specific individual, but we have key data, so their age, their region, their education level. Perhaps, I don't know what they on a day-to-day basis, depending on what the programmatic focus is on a global development basis. So I think transparency is key. But it does have to be anonymized because again, if you're using this in say developing country context, this could fall into the wrong hands. So a clue, for example, they have that transparent levels, they can use it against.
Well, and to the point of modeling, it's not necessarily being all that transparent, like forcing people to be, or encouraging people to be transparent about data gives them incentives to clean things up before model training so that they're not putting things into the model they have no business being.
And I think that's where the
rights
issue is.
Also, if some number of unions on a regular basis shut down.
And where their thing is that we have the data, we have clean data as well. So we actually
Sensitive going. And so that means if you're not going to resource.
even use, because that's where another element is open source is also. If you are using ChatGPT, which is probably earlier, that yes, you can develop a pretty quick solution to it. Who takes ownership of that as well. More than everybody that ChatGPT 5 comes with that, no retrain your whole solution now.
Right.
Or you are using something like Llama and deploying it on your side. And saying like, yeah, we are happy with the output, we don't need to retrain it for the next 2 years. So there's that also element, like from a solution perspective, what is your risk appetite? How much are you with you to read some of those things?
So it'd be worthwhile to
Well,
look.
and when you say people, I think you said people don't know,
Find
when
ways to
people don't
align
know how to
with
approach this, is it a matter of
sustainable energy for all.
having,
I don't know.
like, the way you articulated that, it seemed like these trade-offs are pretty clearly defined. That with proprietary models, you have
Join
maybe
forces.
higher performance, but lower stability and lower, visibility into what's happening.
And
In the
what will
future, as
happen
opposed to
unless
if
we
you
do
use Llama, it's not as good of a model, but at least you're in control of it.
Energy will be needed.
Are the trade-offs really that easy, or are you confused about what the trade-offs are?
I think it's a mix of both. Some organizations are a little bit clear on the
Finding joint forces.
it also depends on how much resources you have available with you. So if you don't have too much resources, then you're like, okay, we need to wait and watch. It's not risk appetite, just go ahead with it and look at what some of the bigger even agencies, World Food Program and stuff are doing.
Source that is.
Terrible
or-
climate outcome.
Get it out there.
I think a lot of the times it's also not clear.
We would like to first ask, is that the right way to go? And or should we
Yeah.
change
Because
that?
the movement of AI has gone so fast that there is suddenly this expectation that everybody.
If you know
Big gap to solution understanding.
where that is not, we're an exception to what I know.
And if you keep calling it AI, but it's really generative AI.
You mean if open source is achieved?
What I would suggest.
Yeah.
LLM.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's where I think the gap is on. Everybody's been using AI for years and years.
And if
That's-
and either one, everybody can try, so it makes it a bit confusing.
Exactly.
And then like what you said, like the decision between we cannot attract technical. So we take these decisions with the help of providers. And there's no transparency. I mean, we know that what models they're using, but about the, the analytics strategy. We capture the knowledge, the training of the model that we establish with them. And on the source data for me, and I like what you said, I think it depends on your expertise and which angle you're starting from. For me, it's the source. I don't have enough, like
You think that
in-house to understand about the transparency of the model. So even if you share it, you need to don't do much with it.
Right.
So it's more the kind of the education aspect or the guidelines for decision makers that are not equipped, to make a smart decision. Government organizations, what they need is.
Giving guidelines. You need it.
Legal aspect becomes very important.
So one theme that I think I've been hearing from a few different people is that different types of openness matter for different types of users, right? That there's some users that the thing that they really care about is reproducibility and reliability. Like, I want to know that this model isn't going to change unless I want it to. There's some users where what they really are going to care about is data problems that I want to make sure that isn't taking in problematic inputs that are going to get me problematic inputs. And then there's people who are fine with a source that's free, the way that puppies are free, and like, you know, that it's going to take a lot of work to keep it running, but you want to have complete control over it. Those are the people who are really yeah.
Because a lot of information out there, so here, as you said, we try to basically accelerate the publishing of the AI.
That's
guideline. Because a lot of people ask me, we have a value guideline, it's very specific, so we don't have it, like, also very hard to read comprehensive and see, incorporate all the different country governance and compliance, all the requirements, GDP, everything. So basically, we say we published a draft, with our legal, and we did the best we can using the headquarters expertise. We also have an AI advisory giving their input because USAID already have some kind of best practice for the US, right? Not even developing the one. So we but now we need to go back to the approach of updating public. Starting in July, we're doing the brochure of the AI policies. So we're going to invite all the country office, 110 of them, in 60 regions. And to leave their inputs, right? Have our legal counsel.
Also, Nigeria didn't have
Including
anything.
Morocco making sure, we're thinking maybe there's a core document, general principles, that is a damage problem. So yeah, research and also economic options.
Some of the.
So maybe
commercial
the demand is more
contributors, they're
intense.
common, they bring their own
Maybe once it's
perspective and goals, actually.
So I just wrote down
So
on this
can
sheet,
you,
Smaller
like,
countries
this
will
is
not have-
multi-stakeholder and
maybe this is sort of like this type of organization I work for. When you say you don't know who's contributing to it, my mind immediately goes to security, right? That someone could be implementing some kind of nefarious backdoor in something through a push request, like, you know, we've seen cases where this has actually happened successfully. Is that what you have in mind, or are you thinking about something else when you say you don't know who's?
Yeah, just regular people to talk about these really complicated issues. They spill over.
Any other thoughts,
So
reactions?
we organized here in Geneva in 2003, then
I guess we got
Asia in
it.
2001. For anyone who doesn't, internet governance,
Oh, that was fine.
essentially it's to do exactly that.
Things like data protection.
Not only
like
AI,
How that can be part of the policy,
touch the
so that safer.
cybersecurity. And anyone is able to shop. Some countries have been really strong.
Where
Do ordering as
it's
a
a
foundation
machine.
to develop.
There was actually a point where someone.
Human rights,
I
access to.
spotted that internally.
Internet at all, can get shut down, and that.
That's really important.
There was a tiny
The reason this
little
was developed,
Could
there
be
was a
like
time.
totally
where
shut down,
the
but like,
business
cross.
center that they were not shut down. That's actually kind of happening right now. So we asked about what countries are doing to make things.
energy.
That is a great example of
Energy,
doing
there's
things right.
Resources.
there's hard infrastructure that needs to be.
There are other countries that learn their example.
Linux is a huge.
Yeah,
It's,
global-
it has. all
There's that
kinds
issue
of-
of that ties with.
It's about, you know,
There's so many acronyms.
If-
we have to
the other being.
Actually, but
I would flag that as
foundational,
you know, the
that would
process
make
is
the
not
burden.
transparent.
Like this.
The process is not.
Believed for a really long time, though, is
Supportive
that
of what you have
open
up there.
source,
So that would be
at
something
least under
that.
the right circumstances, can be more secure because you have more eyes. on
Smaller
it.
country and you're needed. Maybe there can be countries, I would juxtapose that.
Is this a matter of software just
That actually.
so
would be
complicated
good.
that all of
If you
these
say example.
how
absolutely.
Talk about.
is there, is it more about rapid
I didn't mean to give like
places?
weird.
I think it might be.
That's some stuff I've captured. If I've captured it wrong, correctly.
This week, I don't have to note taker here. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot.
Yeah.
What about in this case?
I'm looking at central
Someone kind of working their way up with the
Don't
volunteer.
You don't have to- that was actually one of the meetings.
But to being the person who was the one that they only get paid for presence, and then that person would be kind of like sign off on, like, and so that's why that person would be paid.
I really have an answer, but I thought this is kind of a more question for you.
Found something false, so that it's,
Yeah.
and it's, at least that specific.
Point behind your question is just like, is equitability, we're like really going to get there given the state.
What are the actual steps?
I would add, sorry, I would just add to that, the thing that kept a lot of.
What is development?
Quite a while, that was also because of open source, that was found out in a reasonable time, and then and spinning the open source. So obviously, like maybe in terms of risks.
Bring them up. That's also.
I'll keep it short. In terms of risk, I would just say, what are the risks of not doing it? Especially if you talk about development, you talk about global south voluntarily, and so like, what is the risk of not knowing what the model is trained on, and thereby not knowing what it is likely or not likely to output, access might be excluded from the data sets, and then talking about biases and so on and so on. One concept that I recently read about that I found interesting was it's called marginalism. So looking at, what are the risks of a closed source, of doing something closed source? And then in what sense would open source make it more risky? Because closed source models are closed source, closed AI, it's also risky.
Yeah.
Not just like open.
We did our desk research, and then if you are an institution, this goes, that when you are an
Infrastructure.
That is true, but then with the I mean, I get the business case, we could talk about that. No, I know, and it's true, but I think that you also keep in mind the benefits of open source, right? To build like not the next unicorn, like we work a lot with partners in Africa, for example.
One issue.
And building the next unicorn, building the tools that you need to build an ecosystem and have different players use, for example, speech technology, speech recognition. Like Mozilla does a lot of different. Maybe the last point is that I think it's really important.
Regulatory agenda. And so how do, like, what happens with
The open source initiative works on that, and that's not going to solve everything, but at least it's something to fall back on. Mostly as opposed to the definition of open source software. And we're thinking that, then there will be a lot of watching, like Meta, who have successfully chosen media houses, that Llama is open source, but
So I
it's
think
not
like
open
building
source.
capacity of government.
In what sense?
So we have.
Just for those types.
Yeah.
If I get it, if I remember correctly, it's they have a cap on commercial use of the model, which currently, at least in an early stage, kept any other big tech companies.
As soon as verified.
But it might also include something else. by
So
now.
the level of language.
It is a level of licensing.
Data is a problem.
Exactly.
Some things.
That's always been involved.
So this is a playbook.
Yeah.
Here's a set of plans.
Center.
How would you deal
This open source, this standard.
digital?
Data structure.
Edit
Here's
to
another
and
one.
develop it.
That's
a
Yeah.
There's a lot that's licensed
Yeah.
for
We'd like
not.
to know.
So
Yeah.
within open source,
The
like
other
the
question is about these
and then just because
environments
open
where you
source
have
doesn't mean pick it up and
It's
start
great that
using it.
we all have ideas about AI, but
smaller, specific models that aren't shells.
hey,
Whether do you want to put it
Wire.
expenditure on operating.
And I think that would
each
be
one of those things will be flushed out.
especially where they're.
For risk, there is more a place where you say, yeah, there are some use cases where. we
Yeah,
can
talking
do-
to ourselves.
Maybe as a all AI is all problems.
It
May not need big AI.
So that's not stop. Okay.
Right.
You gave it a
Right.
small AI model.
Yeah.
We are outsourcing the security of it. And the liability, but we are happy with the results, and we don't need to know how it comes to that result if we are happy with that. And there is one last point, like, even from,
Somebody's missed, yeah.
you know, we say that, oh, we don't know.
Yeah. Small AI.
Even with
There is
Microsoft
very.
OpenAI, you can actually put in and see how the solution came to the answer. You know, so there is an option there.
Yeah.
It kind of goes,
Yeah.
it doesn't go exactly
Right.
each and every detail. You can get a certain idea of the fund, of the what, when you came to that argument, which documents you access.
Right. When people use things like thought prompting, that's giving you something that's like transparency, although it's still kind of a fun house. Did I, oh, and over here, yeah.
So.
Actually, because a dozen. Not because we have a lot of data.
Yeah.
Topics we will touch in the.
This is a funny insight, but there's a
Policy.
robot in here somewhere
Not
that's
putting out a-
covering.
You're talking about what are
Um,
the barriers? And
For setting like. Like,
you are
fire
here.
robot that's.
What is this, what is the next step?
Be a glass.
Like,
Like, what are our priorities?
Yes,
That's. Point and educated. How do we, for this particular.
For too long.
Incentivize. We can't do this without. How do you understand?
Data and model.
Video.
At the end,
AI information.
now, what exists now? Society now is biased. Society now is extreme. Society now is good at
Government.
in do
Whatever some of those in.
so. Yes, model generative AI to make sure that shift in the third trade what can I tackle in my first was education, what can I actually regulate? And how can I regulate it? Which has segmented actually that rule is done. So all of those things stay. And the result is university. That's artificial as a major.
So I wanted to speak to the question about what's the negative of
So
not having an open source model.
Yeah.
And I think,
it has great.
again, if we're looking in terms of programs,
Public.
whatever intervention you do, it won't stick culturally. So if you look at any programs where it's not localized or it's not informed by local people,
Enterprises.
the program, no matter how much funding you pump in, no matter how many bells and whistles you stick onto it, within a generation it's gone. Or sometimes, or there's implementation and the people that you're actually trying to help, they see it as an existential threat, which is what most people felt when they talk about AI in the news. They say it's going to take my job. Well, you don't understand what AI is, and no one's really taken the time to explain it through mass media. Therefore, you're seeing it as an existential threat, and that's why there's opposition against it, where it could be used to uplift those and take people to the next level. So if things are closed, and I understand, I'm a big fan of capitalism and private sector because it funds innovation basically, and international development donors are unwilling to fund innovation, which is a shame. And I have different arguments against this. So private sector does innovate change. That's why there needs to be a percentage that is closed to allow for that. But then there also needs to be a time period and exclusivity. So when do you give it back to society? Or what percentage do you give while you're innovating? Or will you train local people in that model while you're creating that? So there needs to be some sort of social contract that doesn't stifle innovation in the private sector. So brings along wider society along those.
Really interesting idea, having that sort of embargo
What
model
aspect?
that also speaks to some of the security concerns around open source models, right? That if this year's open source model is last year's proprietary model, that means that things that are closed down are one step ahead. If you want to
Yeah, I'd be like, what?
rely on those for security mitigation or whatever else. And like we've seen,
Why would it
you know,
not be?
we've seen the same kind of thing in academic publishing where like publishing research is really expensive and journals don't want to do it for free, but at the same time, research is a public good supported by taxes, and so it should be open. And so the compromise people have arrived at is things are 6 months paywalled for the first year when only people who really care a lot are going to demand access to it. Then after that,
It's not restricted at all, and
Right.
if you hold up.
Yeah, sort of going off that, I had a question to contextualize this conversation a little bit. I don't know actually much about your playbook you're creating.
Yeah.
But is it for, maybe some of the others, like general recommendations in international development, or is it to guide USAID's funding in space and time? No connectivity, and I'd love to advocate, to your point, for USAID to only fund open source. And you all must see a shift.
well, it's in our notes now, so that's good.
Great.
So to clarify on that, this is not a USAID policy document. Although it is going to be published by USAID, it's an interagency thing. So we're really picturing this more as something that's aimed at the community at large. Like these are, if you want to intervene in AI and global development, these are some ways that you can do it and some strategies to approach it. So like, we can certainly like recommend an inclination towards open source whenever possible. I think that-
Especially when the US government agency is funding it.
Yeah.
There should be an IP requirement about open source.
That would
It's tough,
be-
but it's tough to enforce that. Like I used to work in like, it's very tough to enforce anything which is intellectual property related. You know, you can't say that, oh yeah, just because we funded you, so now whatever you do, you know, we open source. Then they say like, yeah, sure, we want to work with you.
So
Sometimes.
Speech
First of all, and I mean, that's public money.
Yeah.
So I think we should. Yeah, but then that goes back to the discussion that we should create a community. It's a community. If you have a community push initiative, then it's probably more successful than a regulation. Because that's, they say like, yeah, sure, let's give you a small for free, but the major chunk that is actually giving you good results. And it's proprietary and we're not gonna use your funds. Then you say like, okay, but now we're not getting the benefit of up to date model.
But then there's.
And then also goes to like, how do you copyright? You can say like, okay, just because we funded the next 2
Large
years, that's.
Are there any other?
I think that's a really good framing to be like,
Discussion and nobody's gonna
Thinking
get.
about-
people will pay money, people small.
So
Yeah.
there are
You
different
know,
kinds of money,
month.
right? Like, I don't want to speak
In
for
most
all
cases,
organizations, but in USAID, the
Yeah.
primary channels for funding things are through grants and contributions
Well,
to the contract. We are buying a thing, we are
That
issuing a
invalid
set of
data.
specifications. We can totally say like, you know,
Yeah.
12 months after completion or whatever, this needs to be open source. And people who don't like that won't bid on it. For a grant, that's really different. I'm looking at a university or an NGO or somebody else saying, what we think you're already doing is really cool. We're going to give you some more.
So you see, it's already an invitation.
We have a lot less ability to tell people what to do in situations like that. And so I think in some of those cases, having an open source stipulation would work. There's not some.
It on and if we look at now, we're doing to connect with whatever the policy ends up being. So my point on.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground, what they actually want to see. So trade-off. Yeah, AI products themselves.
Yeah.
The best struggle. And then there is a challenge of how are we gonna continue. Obviously, all the open source without the community is.
And so,
Solution that nobody should win.
yeah, particularly not that difficult.
Yeah.
Create,
That's
AI
probably a
products
question,
that
like how to provide.
Yeah, it's really so like, would,
And if you fund
I
it,
would say.
there has to be some understanding of what's the development strategy. Because many times the development comes with the funding from the private sector,
a
which
sense of like.
gives funding, but also helps the
Model.
decision.
These kids,
What's their-
and then be able to have a general sense.
Where
of,
they
like,
would. And
Required.
if there's a
Required for them. This is our mapping.
Yeah.
See, there's a problem from my side for the last 6 months.
Lots of-
Yeah, but also
Whenever
I mean,
you're
linked to that, it's how you
access.
Yeah, but ability strategy.
For agriculture.
Products.
ensure that
and
the solution
Use of
actually
it,
maintain
water,
beyond
these kind of
or you could
actual
take
life-saving
a narrative and it take it up to.
those use cases, if you're
Which
from
is in the sense of kind of having met to end of a certain point. You need to see maybe some, as far as AI solutions, also infrastructure. Because they provide a foundational structure to build other applications. Requires also
The lowest possible. yield and the easiest
And
possible
I think
model.
one thing about the channels, one
Yeah, no, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Industrial.
much like
There's a digital X department that is a specific program to actually catalog all the open source solutions that are there that could be used for the public good. And 95% of those solutions are there.
Yeah.
They have a lot, they were built, I mean, sometimes it's good, I mean, open source serves also being this, and that somebody is using existing piece of solution to create something new and something better. So but then.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Sure, that's also when we work with project-based grants, this is never part of the grant. So ideally, as non-profit, we would also love to have kind of progress on what's used to be seen as indirect cost, IT, et cetera, getting a bigger chunk of money because we need stability for the. So I just want to very important when you speak outside of the.
Yeah.
Short term.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it comes back to the conversation about digital public. When you are developing really foundational systems for identity management or for health information systems or things like that.
Yeah.
Not want those to land among that 95% of dead projects you were mentioning because people would really depend on them. And so there's then this push to come up with different models of support for different models of sustainability for these digital public infrastructure solutions to make sure those stay around. Maybe in the future, we'll see some kind of foundational AI system being regarded as digital public infrastructure that is still not there yet, but in a world where some of these open source models evolve into something like.
Yeah. Just wanted to, on the risk of open source, and I don't want to mitigate data leaks or anything, but the risk of open source is somewhat similar to the risk of, if you're trying to reach some of the most remote and marginalized communities,
We would have a rich.
often you're dealing with very sensitive information and the, I guess, facilitators have paper-based records.
Yeah.
Anyone can break into an office and steal it. In fact, it has happened during COVID. So when we talk about open source, it just means that it's the scale of that data leak. But I think you mentioned that.
Don't think
And
that
I just,
it's-
the point I'm trying to make is that they're similar risks, just scalable. And I think mitigate the fact that now it's a digital world, so people somewhat expect data leaks. Not to say it's a good thing, but there are risks anywhere.
So I think you're right. At the same time, you know, this risk of a model leaking data from prompts or training data or whatever else is one possible risk in open source. I think another risk people are concerned about is that the model could work perfectly and work perfectly at things that we would rather not do, like, you know, automating cyber attacks or designing chemical weapons, whatever other nightmare scenario you want to think about. That's where people can build very, very capable open source models. We lose a lot of the ability to keep those models from doing certain things that we have with proprietary models, where, you know, they can kind of build a filter that's always imperfect, but is at least going to screen out certain types of
How
prompts. in the case of
Talk about compute.
Yeah.
Right, but other stuff like education.
Yes.
That's we were talking about the education ministry,
Yeah,
not
that
just
is
the.
right.
Maybe
Then the question is, who gets to define to control what credible use is, who has oversight? So it's ownership, but it's also oversight and accountability, right?
Obviously, like a bunch of billionaire white guys.
Exactly.
Yeah. We had one fucking law through that
Yeah.
earlier.
Looking at this.
But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's that question of democratic control and like, is it much safer to have a private company make sort of yeah.
That's why contrary to her, I do believe the state's role is actually to protect and to regulate international relations, because we cannot leave all
It turns out that nobody is fully.
only can serve themselves. Like,
They said.
now the international relations are being changed.
So
That's
even
so
I
we'll
will
see.
see, like, really and we're seeing this play out in real time. Basic fundamental needs.
Sure, there's a lot of grants and projects where a lot of these
State.
state.
So many hats.
Download now.
And what are some of the legislative barriers to actually using general? And I'm saying this from my perspective, not everybody needs to work on agencies. The for biometric process, I don't think information researching countries are bound to purchase commercially available solutions. Just the one space where everyone's like, hey, the algorithm, metric systems, et cetera.
Is there anything else that actually
Use, the people are
just building AI
commercial, the
come
available
across these
solutions
challenges?
because of the blame and the accountability and all the different things. So I wonder in how much removing some legal barriers, making things more accessible and usable, would then also feed into the sustainability.
Can I
of
ask, like,
connection, how many as a long-term tracks do you need?
Yeah, and I mean,
How many
to,
times?
I'm sure other countries have analogous processes. In the US, we have something. If federal government agencies want to use a software system, it has to go through something called
How
FedRAMP
pervasive
certification.
is?
And FedRAMP certification is very expensive. If you're Microsoft, you can front the money to get your stuff FedRAMP certified, and then you have this huge customer base. If you're an open source project, nobody has the money, and so
But I want to make sure
who wants to use it is on the hook for paying for that certification.
And I think the important thing, if I can just follow up on that, is that this is actually what society and policymakers would actually wish. In my particular domain, I had
Good, sorry.
conducted a public survey where we actually asked both parliamentarian members and members of society what they would wish law enforcement to use open source in-house developed and commercially available ones, and everyone said open source or in-house.
Really fascinating.
I mean, it's so logical. If the trust is in the institution,
Yeah,
not
anybody
necessarily-
can audit it. Yeah.
So why not go
Yeah.
out to the
Okay.
laws to maintain the trust that is there?
So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think we had a hand there first.
yeah, no, I was just thinking, what are the risks of not open sourcing something? Given my position as an academic. Yeah, I cannot compete with OpenAI today.
Yeah.
Even with all the money Switzerland can give me, the federal institute, I can never show them on the small problem. So the number of bad actors are too high. The number of good actors in the political space is
Yeah.
and the number of bad actors, so. For problem, yes, the double point, what I wanted to go to. Middle ground where some of us agree on certain things, maybe make it open source, because at the greater voice, researchers, or people who work on then where can we have regulation is easier to control. For example, even though I get you all the data, all the knowledge.
Use the AI
I don't have the computing
with
resources.
accountability.
So it's better for us to have. We need how they concept them. The ratio is going on there about computing resources, but that's something you can control, right? Oh, who's buying the GPUs for training?
Join us a little bit later. Everybody introduce themselves, but yeah, we're answering these questions.
Honestly, control.
Always finding creative ways to get.
This was great chat.
It's one more thing that I think could come up.
I think we should find.
Thank you so much.
There's
Um,
control that.
uh,
Just on the fundamental risk management that you. I think also there's a lot of stories around, but not a lot of evidence. And I think making a
I like
informed
that
decision.
term, doom stories.
I mean, we need more evidence.
Yeah.
But we also need an industry standard for the public. Those small businesses, and they're interesting pieces. So it's really hard to make a decision if they don't have some of the fundamentals.
Sorry, I mean, the old stories about the result.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all this talk about, okay, and then you.
So I think that's another issue is like, how do we make it further?
And I think we need to understand that. I mentioned, Danielle already mentioned marginal risk is one approach to assess the risk of proprietary open source. But we need more information and more rigorous. Not is just emotional. So we all have a beautiful imagination of the heaven that we
I know there's.
national.
In some cases, like there is. Say,
Governors trying to.
I have a document. If you ask me.
If I understand it correctly.
I don't know what they
He's deciding.
Ask, that should not be used as an idea, because it is not there. That's where I think a lot of the thinking that are there is like,
City levels.
open source don't perform very well, or maybe we are not using them properly. What we want.
It's sustainable.
Are they?
Yeah,
That's
like-
something I've always found frustrating about measuring LLM performance, is I never know if it's my fault.
Light at the end of this tunnel, it's not gonna be so.
Yeah.
Talking too much. I just wanted to talk about the ownership piece. So the most, where you'll see the most uplift in regards to open source code are also probably the countries that have the least amount of trust in their government. Reason. So we need checks and balances. So
Drawing a lot of.
I think a good example is again, using private sector to inform and be a part of working committees. So for example, in India, digital
Plateaus.
was created by a number of founding Indian companies,
Understanding.
tech company owners. And that's meant that sellers on the side of the road have a QR code which links to a bank. So we have to understand that where we can make those AI open source code.
What they should be
Cases where they have a very tenuous relationship with government. It needs layers.
Has an
International regional organizations to work, and then within that, make sure the private sector and the public sector come together, and then the public holding accountable. It can't just be one
everyone's really.
particular group doing anything. If you have a democratic country, next election, everybody will check. So you need some sort of oversight.
Yeah.
The other side is USAID considered approaching.
Yeah, sorry, I was like, the. Kind of a meta comment.
Public.
It's free.
Around.
But I wonder why we should be, why we come up.
We have just started, we are.
Gates and roots of. I mean,
That was a summary of the real.
They're part of
real
it.
question.
So we have a
I didn't feel like writing that much.
No, it just feels like, this is different radio, just whatever, it's small, like, source,
Yeah.
it's not global, and we need to justify it. But you access to
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sure you know.
I think you put in the comment of like middle ground between open source and proprietary, and I just wanted to
gap.
talk on that. Also, when you speak about business.
Ensuring there's funding for
With partners, to say that, like, I'm an advocate for open source, but it doesn't mean that everything that everyone is doing has to be open source. You know, there's also a case for private companies, for business models, with closed applications. And just to give you an example, like maybe some of you know me more from Lilapa speaking earlier, they work on language technology, and there's a few others working in the language tech space who are very committed to building something that is open so that others can build on it, but then also creating tools that are closed in a way that they can somehow create revenue. And there's different ways to create revenue with open source, not just by closing, but also by creating services around it and so on. And I think that's also nice. That's a really nice model to sort of say, look, we do something that is open. We make part of it open, like certain aspect of the certain amount of the data set, for example. But then we create something more specialized, and then we close off, and then we ask them like premium service to ask people to pay money for. And this way, you at the same time build an ecosystem like Kenya or Rwanda or South Africa, and have something that you as a company can also make money.
So that
we
Really
can
like
plug
balancing
ourselves.
that idea with the embargo notion, and just really finding a way to balance public good with market-driven innovation. I also wanted to quickly speak to the maintenance of solutions. One is being a risk of open source, and one is also highlight that it's also a risk of proprietary products too. I mean, Google has their graveyard of, apps and what have you. I believe it's called like Google's graveyard. Yeah, totally. But just thinking about the risks of proprietary too. Cancel each other out potentially.
We only have a couple more minutes. I'm sorry, I didn't catch anybody's name. I want to get back to something you said about, there being a lot of potential in places where there's maybe not a lot of trust in government. So the team that's writing the playbook, one way that they're thinking about framing this, and they may stick with this or not, is to, come up with different types of different issues we might be working in,
Those guys.
countries that have maybe problems with backsliding democracy versus those that have robust democratic institutions and different ways of slicing and dicing the world. I'm just curious from what you said, it wasn't 100% clear to me how that level of political openness would influence your choice to go with an open source versus a closed source solution.
It wasn't that clear because I'm also confused.
Okay.
So I'm trying to make sure that everybody understands I don't have any answers. And I feel like that would base itself on the idea of there being an ideal government. So it's even I don't know the statistics, but experts that do this. Even good governments have questions at the moment, and anyone can do anything with data. I think in the UK there was a really recent example. I get to publish a Chinese spy there recently. And what if he had access to that? So, and the UK is known as being a fairly good government, especially over the last century.
I'm sure at a certain point, they'd also be.
That is, I don't know, sorry.
Well, and it makes me think of
Think we could get,
I once heard a cybersecurity person give this talk of different kinds of risks that you
There's something
face.
that would be interesting.
One of those is successor risk. You build a system and someone else is going to inherit it after you're done. And they'll change it in ways, but you can build things in a way that there's some aspects hard to change. And others easy to change. Yeah.
It's important to build your objective. It's just general. To solve and when so on. To solve. So a lot of different are. If they feel like every national sovereign country. Problem states. So you need to means having access to computer.
Models are built for certain contexts. And it's also cheaper and more accessible in these contexts. So not only is this like expensive to get that cookie, sometimes you know, like national order, when it work, you even get the same baseline as it's like kind of ready off the shelf, ready to use.
So
But not
also agree
inclusive,
with
like,
what
not
supervisory or open source can or cannot know whether data comes from some strict, but train the algorithm, is it biased?
Because it wasn't trained with
the answering of the question.
in that language model.
To the risk of like
So if you bring that
like with
with
technology.
technology.
We love appropriately.
So
Like with technology, there's going to be.
it evolves.
Sure, that thought, and then I need a volunteer to say.
I just have a mentality based on, and there are obviously one conversations in the background, and then at the end, it's then things like that, the public, but again, who maintains them, so that was like, like gonna maintain it, and like.
They basically measure people's thoughts.
Sure
You see it, brain, use it on the screen. There are ways you could get the
When you get
public's
the
pulse.
plane, we are here with only fire. We were able to afford.
About these as possibilities in the future. Right.
Because certain reasons that there are people that
Think about like how do we get decision like
lose space, be heard. Many times those are the. probably use those solutions the most. There are many times using them because they help them do more, but they don't always even understand.
Yeah, it's the least
Sounds-
developed country.
Oh, yeah, I just wonder. Questions, but do you also work with communities?
Oh, right, the minerals come from Congo to build the chip. Correct.
Wasn't the one who read all the RFI responses. There were, a lot that came in, but again, those tended to come from people who read the Federal Register, which is not the vast majority of humans. But it's, people who typically have some sort of business or political interest in responding when the government asks for input. And so we're doing our best to talk to people who have networks and are hearing from folks all over the place. And that's always a problem. I think one more intervention and then we probably need to start closing.
Yes, Andrew giving a talk at the Higgs conference in Hawaii, and he pointed out something also when developing countries, those societies tend to have much less skepticism in the implications of the consequences of that. They express much more optimism and openness, and I think that that's also a valuable asset that we, like it or not, exploit and try to enforce this idea of openness by design, because it then also gives opportunity for oversight that you don't have, and also learn the lessons from more developed countries that having commercial only be the default and not necessarily a good thing, because it leads to deterioration in terms of trust. It was an interesting thing that I was not aware of, that there was such a divide in terms of skepticism and trust.
That one's complicated. That's complicated. I saw some opinion polling on that not long after ChatGPT came out. And there was one study that was, finding the US, Europe as being much more skeptical than everyone else. I've heard claims in the other direction as well. There's also an interesting breakdown that within countries, it tends to be wealthier people, more educated people, younger people, and men who are more enthusiastic about AI than people who are not. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch that space over the coming years, because it could just be that people get more skeptical as they're exposed to more media about AI, and the US and Europe are already in the lead on it. But
Interesting that you say the media, because that is the main shaper of, impressions, and it's based on a lot of media. Trying to get them. I don't know whether we have to give the evidence that would be very the rare case. Like, I don't think the onus should be.
Hi, everyone. Wrap up the discussions in the next minute.
that's what I was planning.
Perfect. So then move to read out.
Okay, so 60 seconds. In the next 60 seconds, we're going to have a democratic election based on picking the person who raises their hand first. Does anyone want to be the volunteer to give the readout? I'm not doing it.
Me neither.
Okay, 2 down. 3. Does anybody want to give our readout? Okay, we've got 2 candidates up. Front.
Used to be at USA.
Anybody? You've got the notes. Do you want to? Wonderful. And speaking of notes, if you have things that you wrote on stickies, please come stick them up here, because this is going to be, this notes are going to be my record of what happened in this conversation. I am jet lagged and will not remember any of this the moment I walk out the door. So having it written down will help a lot.
Yeah, no.
So what's your box?
Yeah, it'll be, playbooks. And the RFI responses are probably the thing that people want something.
Yeah.
What about this?
Okay.
Wow. Oh, wow.
They were down.
Yeah.
Whoever's here, background, I'm more international when everyone's
Yeah.
We take our seat, so we can do a quick wrap up. We would love to give some feedback to you about what we discussed.
Wow, okay.
Please take a seat, everyone.
I was telling her I was coming.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for such, I feel like all three groups had very diverse discussion. So first, huge thanks for being here, for staying, for not leaving after the introduction, and for actually engaging and participating and giving us your points of view. We really do listen to each of these things that you've said, think about it and workshop it, and so please know that your time here was well spent. But we want to hear what you talked about. I'm very curious. So let's start with group one. I don't know if we have somebody. So that was the open source versus foundation models. Who's our readout
Back there.
person? You want the mic?
Hi, everyone. I was the note taker for group one, and I'm also giving the readout. So in this group, we talked about open source versus proprietary models, and we focused the conversation around what should be open source versus proprietary, what are issues related to standards that we need to consider, and how to deal with the risks of open source. We had a really robust discussion on the first topic. I think one issue that we discussed a lot was what do we mean when we say open source? It's not necessarily straightforward. There's source code is not the whole story. Open source can be somewhat generic, but or the source code can be somewhat generic, but model weights are very significant and sources of data are very significant. The explainability of the model is very important, and all of these aspects can be very influenced by issues related to bias and where the data is coming from and how it's being analyzed. On the second topic related to standards, we discussed the need to develop a standard definition of open source related to the issues I was just talking about, and also industry standards for the public release of models, and how measuring LLM performance can be difficult because of a variety of issues. So standards related to LLM performance could be very relevant. And then in the third category, talking about the risk of models falling into the wrong hands. One perspective that was brought up was that we also need to consider the risks of not going open source. Oftentimes the conversation is framed around proprietary models being the default and open source being an alternative, but there are lots of risks associated with proprietary models as well. Especially in places where the people in control of those models may not be trustworthy. So that's something that needs to be considered. And then there are also a lot of risks associated with implementing these models and reaching remote marginalized communities. There are risks associated with paper-based records, and then when you have open source models that can scale up those risks of stealing data, for example. And then outside of the three topics, the main topics, there was also some really interesting discussion around funding sources and the types of rules associated with funding coming from specific places. For example, contracts versus grants, and how IP and innovation fits into that conversation. So yeah, that's it from group one. Yeah.
Hi. So group two, we had a really excellent discussion, I thought. And just to give you a little bit of background on our group, we had folks who were coming at the questions from a data perspective. We had folks coming at it from government in China, UK, also folks who represent business, WeGo, and just, it was a really very diverse group. And so I thought it was a great discussion. We wound up sort of coming up with some themes that we thought addressed the first question. So something that we thought needed to be a part of how you would improve participation. The agreement was that you want more participation, not limited participation. And the way to do that would be through transparency, through inclusivity, to address tension versus cohesion, and also to look at participation and have a discussion regarding what is meaningful participation. You know, it's not just checking the box, but how do people actually feel that they've been able to meaningfully participate in the process? With respect to other countries have done to make more inclusive, we heard some inputs that were really interesting, just discussing the city versus national dynamic of working on some of these policies. And also heard some good work that's going on with respect to the educational component in China on AI, heard from Turkey, and I'm probably leaving something out, but it was a very, very good discussion.
And we were group 3, forward, and we were talking about access to compute and the energy implications of that as well. And I'm going to pass over to Dr. Chooks to do our handout.
Thank you. We discussed in details how access to computing and energy consumption can be limited to solutions and startups in the AI ecosystem. So part of what we discuss is how can computing powers be made available to regions that needed it the most. We looked at Africa as a nation, and we also discussed how some countries may want it domiciled in their cloud, or maybe within the continent, which can be challenging. So we also look at the costing, having each country, for example, Africa, owning their computing power. Why not consider a neighboring country having it, and another smaller country will just ride on that? So which was also well discussed. we look at the human rights challenges somebody mentioned about maybe for the sake of election or political reasons, government may want to shut down some the data center or server centers. So in that case, some solutions should be thought of how it can be prevented. Then solution around providing this data center should also lie around public-private sector partnership, which was agreed upon because it's not something an individual government can ride or drive all alone. And we look at also considering the medium scale provisioning of this solution. For example, you need 24,000 some GPUs to train some large language models. But the truth is that not all solutions or businesses, sorry, I don't.
We
So
can hear you.
not all solutions or businesses require that much. Some business just require as little as 10 GPUs or 100. So there can be many little enterprises providing this solution, and it will go a long way in solving great problems for startups and entrepreneurs. And for example, we look at people focusing on agriculture sector for solutions. They don't need all the language larger models to train whatever they are training. We looked at safety as well. As much as energy is necessary and computing power, there should be cybersecurity solution. So the risk of having the computing companies dominate the sectors such as, for example, Amazon, the Nvidias. So what is the risk? Okay, somebody mentioned, yeah, it can kind of, should I say, what if something happened to that they shut down the out of power? So they need to decentralize that when providing the solution. So open source will also limit or reduce the quest for people to access computing power. So whereas they don't need to train if they can get an open source asset. So basically, in a nutshell, this is what we discussed. Section. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you.